Hey everyone, welcome to Perko's podcast. Thanks so much for joining me from all over the planet. We got people that are joining us for the live recording from Vietnam, which is super cool, California, cold Wisconsin, and beautiful west coast of Australia, Perth, which my friends in Perth always tell me, West Coast, best coast, and I always refer to them as the California of Australia. And the guys in California that are listening to this, or my friend Chuck that's on tonight, he would attest to the same thing. Something about the sunsets on the West Coast. They're just amazing. So, hey, thanks. There's a sunset behind Chuck, who's with us on the call in California tonight. But it's middle of the day here in Australia. I'm so pumped to have each of you guys on the call. We're gonna do something a little bit different. I'm just gonna walk through some things about Sabbath. That's what the theme of the podcast is today. And as I go through each of these things, I'm gonna actually ask you to unmute yourself and to chime in if you have a question or a comment about anything that we're talking about related to Sabbath, because I want to learn from you guys. This is not just me telling you what I've learned, but I would like to learn from you guys, because I do not think that I'm an expert on this thing called Sabbath, this practice. And we're all on a journey, and I'm just a fellow traveler on the journey as I'm discovering all of these incredible gifts that God has given us, including the gift of Sabbath. So I'll start off by saying this. I've probably been influenced the most around Sabbath by a handful of people, authors, speakers, that have been really influential in my picking up the practice of Sabbath. First, I was introduced or really challenged to the idea of taking a Sabbath and making it a part of my weekly practice by my good friend and a mentor of mine, Lance Witt. So Lance actually has a tool, a resource that he shared with me that I'm going to share with everybody listening to the podcast and those that are part of the live recording. But also Ruth Haley Barton, who wrote a fantastic book called Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership, is a fantastic read. She also wrote another equally as excellent resource called Invitation to Retreat, the importance of getting away and spending time with Jesus. And so those two books have been really helpful. Pete Scazzero, who I feel like I refer to him as the modern day godfather of soul care. He has been hugely influential in my thinking around Sabbath and healthy practices of rhythms and things. And then recently this year, Dallas Willard and John Mark Comer both have been very influential in some of the thinking that I've had around Sabbath. So I just wanted to start off by saying these are the people that have really influenced my thinking. And what has been most influential, because I get asked all the time, Jason, why do you even practice Sabbath? Like, isn't that an ancient, Jewish tradition that God required the nation of Israel to practice? Why do you practice it as a New Testament Christian, as a New Testament follower of Jesus? And the reason why I practice it really comes down to this. I don't practice it because I feel like I have to. I practice it because I feel like I get to. So it's not a have to, it's a get to. And the reason why I do it is because as a follower of Jesus, I really want to pattern my life after not just the lessons that Jesus taught, but also the lifestyle that he lived. So for me, the lessons that Jesus taught, I actually think are near impossible to follow if you don't adapt the lifestyle that Jesus lived. So oftentimes Christians try to adopt and take on the lessons that Jesus did and that he taught without taking on his lifestyle. And I think that the two of them, his lifestyle and the lessons he taught, actually go together. And part of his lifestyle was taking a weekly Sabbath. And then I get to thinking about the fact that Jesus was there in the beginning. His best friend, John, told us that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. And so Jesus was there in the beginning when God created Sabbath. And so in the very beginning of creation, Jesus created Sabbath. And then when he was here on earth, incarnate, he actually practiced it. And so this is something that I just feel like as a follower of Jesus, if I'm going to adopt his lifestyle, then the reason why I practice Sabbath is because I want to live the way that Jesus lived. And I think that it empowers me to actually fulfill the lessons that he taught in the midst of that. So my personal definition of of Sabbath, or the purpose behind Sabbath, I really boil it down to two things. I see it as a day of the week or a rhythm that helps to replenish my soul and rejoice in God's goodness. So how's that for, a preacher? 2 hours, replenish my soul and rejoice in God's goodness. That's the purpose of it. So why I do it is because Jesus modeled it, and I want to live the way that Jesus lived as a follower of Jesus. And then the purpose that I see behind it is to replenish my soul and to rejoice in God's goodness to me. So one of the things that I've done is I've developed these 5 P's that I call them to help me with the practice of Sabbath. And I'm just going to walk you through the 5 P's. I think it will actually help answer some of the questions that you guys submitted prior to the podcast recording today. But if we don't hit on one of those, we're going to have you ask those questions and obviously chime in at any time. So any thoughts though, or any questions that you have behind, like, Jason, why you do it, and then kind of the purpose behind it, or even any comments as to what you've experienced from doing it on your own?
Yeah, well, I feel like the hardest part for me is to be consistent with it. We end up getting too many irons in the fire, and then we feel like we don't have time to have a Sabbath.
Yeah. So just the consistency side of it makes it a challenge to do it every week. Yeah. Anybody else, something they've learned about why they've maybe dabbled in it, or maybe the purpose behind it from your own learnings?
I think for me, it's also been this toss-up. I know in me, I have a tendency to get a little bit legalistic and kind of like, give me the exact rules. Like, is this thing allowed on Sabbath? Is this thing not? Yes. And sort of wanting to get in this really strict rules, which I don't think actually serves the purpose at the end of the day. Like, it becomes work in itself, trying to work out what's work. Yeah. And I know that obviously that was quite a big thing in the Old Testament and in Jewish culture, is, these very strict rules around Sabbath. So kind of, I love that idea of, let's look at the purpose of it, and having that kind of framework to look at everything that I'm approaching in my day as, is this replenishing my soul? Yeah. Is this helping me rejoice in God's goodness? Gives a different way of approaching it, rather than these rules of what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do. So I think that's, a really helpful framework.
I always, whenever I think of that, Jody, I love the fact that you brought that up, because I struggle with that same thing as far as, am I becoming legalistic about this? And I'm constantly reminded, Jesus in Mark chapter 2, they're walking through the fields. He gets challenged about picking, grain of wheat, and his response to those that had begun to really worship the practice rather than worship the God of the practice. His response was that classic, well-known phrase where he says, no, man was not made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath was made for the man. And so that's been so helpful for me to look at it and say, whoa, this is actually a gift that God made for our enjoyment, and for us to then reflect and rejoice in his goodness to us because of that gift, not some drudgery or some sort of discipline that I have to make sure I do a specific way. I think that's been super helpful for me, is to remember that no, Sabbath was made for the man, not man for the Sabbath, has been super helpful. So, well, here's the first P that I use that has been super helpful as I began practicing Sabbath. Is the first thing that I had to do was I had to prioritize it. And I know that it sounds cliche, but I just feel like if I didn't make the decision to say, I want to implement the practice of Sabbath, and I'm deciding to do it personally, then it was never going to happen. And so I just had to make the decision. This is something that I want to implement into my weekly routine. Not because I have to, but because I get to. And because the Sabbath was made for me, I want to really, essentially, I want to unpack this gift that God gave me every single week. And I don't want to just set it to the side. So I had to prioritize it. And this, I think, speaks to the question that a few people had as it relates to, what if I'm the only person in my home that wants to prioritize it. And so that was a reality for me in the beginning. It wasn't something that was on other people's radar. And I go back to that whole idea of what I said before we pressed record and started the recording. You know, the teacher will appear when the student is ready. And so if I was forcing my priorities onto everybody else in my household, they might not be ready for it. But this is something that God has prioritized and put on my heart. And so I think the best way, and the way that I've seen it work in our family, is this: that as I prioritized it and as I began to model it, it was amazing how everybody wanted in. So when I began to model it in front of my wife and my kids, all of the sudden, everyone wanted in on Sabbath. They were like, something's going on, and Dad is loving his Sabbath like crazy, and I want some of that. And I've just found, like anything in life, I think it's true, those that are involved in weight loss programs, oftentimes you don't have to go around selling it to your friends. When you're modeling it, your friends start to see the change in your own life, in your own heart and your own soul, and they want what you have. And so they ask you, hey, what program are you on? What diet are you doing? What workout routine? I think the same is true with Sabbath. When I prioritized it and began to model it, it was amazing how it caught on and kind of caught fire within our family. So any questions or any comments related to that prioritizing, or anything related to that question of how do you do it when your whole family's not doing it, Chuck?
Yeah, just the prioritizing. When me and my wife started to practice Sabbath, it was, pre-COVID, and it was just us. It was the day we sent the kids off to school, and we kind of started that day, and then they came home and they were a part of that. But it felt it didn't feel like we were really doing Sabbath. There was too many other normal things that you do in life, and so when we moved out here, and in the midst of coronavirus, just the act of Sabbath just changed for us because our kids were involved, and so we chose something that we all love, the beach, and it became it's such a big priority. It's like the big focal point for the week. My kids we go on Friday. After Zoom school, 2.5 hours. The blessing of coronavirus is they only go to school for 2.5 hours, and we have time to kind of pack and get going. And we spend the day at the beach. But on Friday night when we get home, they start counting the days until the next Sabbath.
Yeah.
So it becomes more a priority than everything else we do. It's something we talk about every day, and so that's been a blessing for us in prioritizing it. That our kids love it.
That is huge, Chuck. So big. And the fact that you are modeling something for your kids at such a young age, man, the life-changing impact that could have for them for the rest of their lives is just massive. So I just want to commend you and applaud you for making it a priority and then modeling that in front of your kids. I think it will be, you may never know all of the impact that it has on their lives, but I'm sure it will. Chuck touched on something that I think is really important, and it's actually the second P that I use. So the first P is prioritizing it. The second one is planning for Sabbath. And the third one is, I'm going to jump into the third one. It's actually preparation. And I actually see a difference between planning for it and preparing. So I'll explain that difference. The reason why I see a difference is planning for Sabbath actually goes back to the purpose of Sabbath. And Jody, you talked about a moment ago when we were talking about purpose, you talked about this filter of replenishing and rejoicing, activities that cause me to be replenished and rejoice, are really kind of the framework that makes up, well, what do you do with Sabbath? And so we'll get into, hey, what does Sabbath actually look like? And I would say my answer to that question is Sabbath should look different for everyone, because everyone is different in how they replenish and how they rejoice in God's goodness. So there's some strict formula that just describes, hey, here are the things that you must do in order to replenish and rejoice. That's going to look different for each of us. So one of the things in planning that I've found incredibly helpful that my wife and I and even our kids have done is what's called a replenishment cycle. It's a simple tool that my friend Lance Witt shared with me, and I'll make it available to you guys as well. And it's simply just a circle with 5 boxes around it. And I'm actually going to bring it up on the screen so that you guys can see it for those that are on the live recording. It's a simple circle that has 5 boxes around the circle that allow you to take a look at the different things in your life that replenish you. So I don't know, can everybody see? Give me a thumbs up if you can see that circle. And yep, awesome. So there are 5 boxes around this replenishment cycle. And the idea is to come up with the top 5 things that are most replenishing to you in your life, and then to write those into the boxes, and then to think about the frequency and the quantity of how much you need those things. So, for example, one of the things that I find most replenishing in life is watching live sports. I absolutely love it. So I'll buy tickets to go watch rugby league games. I love watching Test cricket, which for most people in the Northern Hemisphere, they don't even have a clue what that means. And the thought of spending 5 entire days, you talk about an extended Sabbath. A Test cricket match is literally a 5-day Sabbath. It's so good. So you just go watch sports for 5 days straight. Like, that's incredibly replenishing for me. I find that so replenishing. My wife absolutely loves live music. She loves it. So any live music, whether it's jazz or classical, or we even one time accidentally sat down the front at a concert for a screamo band, and we quickly got up after like the second song and we listened to it from a little bit further back. It was fantastic. But the point is, discovering what is replenishing to your soul is a personal thing, and it's part of planning for Sabbath. And so looking at those 5 areas, writing those in, and then taking a look at what's the quantity needed and the frequency needed. So it might be that, you know, Chuck and Kasha that are on this recording, they like to go to the beach, and that's the frequency of that is weekly. And the quantity of that is minimum 3 to 4 hours. And so they just write beach time. Now, doing this as a family, number one, helps to get buy-in from others about what we're going to do on Sabbath. And it also allows you to plan your Sabbath and say, hey, these are collectively activities that are replenishing for all of us. And so we might spend half of our Sabbath doing some of those things. And then we might even break up. Our kids are a little bit older and say, hey, mom and dad are going to go do this thing that's replenishing to us. You guys feel free to go do your thing. Or we pick and choose each week something that's replenishing depending on people in the family and what their needs are. So I've just found this replenishment cycle to be incredibly helpful when it comes to planning for Sabbath, which really leads me to talk about, a lot of people have this concept of Sabbath just being a day where you sit around and maybe look out the window and do nothing. I happen to be a 3 on the Enneagram, and that couldn't be more not replenishing to me than replenishing. Like, I love activity. I love doing things. And so my wife and I, this past Sabbath, we actually went and rented scooters in the city in Brisbane where we live, and we scooted all over the city, went across the Story Bridge. It was just the most incredibly enjoyable day, and finished up with a long, slow lunch down by the river. But all of that to say, I think you can, as you plan for it, discover the things that are most replenishing for you and the other members in your family as well. So any questions about that, or any comments, anything that you've experienced? I know some of you have dabbled with practicing Sabbath. Anything that you've experienced and you've learned that planning for it has been helpful for you?
Now, what if you and your wife have different things that would replenish you? Like, I could sit in a coffee shop for an hour and just have a cappuccino and read a book, but that doesn't replenish her.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we've practiced kind of sharing some of the activities. So for example, Kristen, my wife, loves coffee, and I don't drink coffee. I drink tea. In fact, I'm drinking a delicious Assam Bold right now, which is fantastic. So, but what I've done to help me with the practice of Sabbath is that I've I've decided for me personally that being on digital media and social media and just being on digital devices during Sabbath for me is draining. So I not only look at the purpose of Sabbath as being replenishing and rejoicing in God, I also look at activities that are either draining or distracting. So that's been helpful for me. If something's draining or distracting, I try not to do it on Sabbath. So my phone quite literally has been quite distracting. So several months ago, I decided to actually get the Saturday newspaper delivered to my house so that I wasn't on anything digital for Sabbath. And so we now have a practice most Saturday mornings where we go to a local coffee shop where she loves the coffee, and we sit and I drink tea, she drinks coffee because it's so replenishing for her. And I read the newspaper because that I don't want to sit and just stare at coffee beans being roasted. That would be very draining for me. So I actually read a physical newspaper like a very old man, and I love it. It's so replenishing for me. But I think it's kind of finding that balance of saying, hey, I know that she would love, he would love to do this, and that's not that replenishing for me, but maybe reading is super replenishing for the other person. And so they say, hey, let's combine these two things. I'll read while you sit and just kind of stare out the window and get replenished by that. Whatever it is that floats your boat in that way. So yeah. The next P that I wrote down is prepare. So the idea of preparation, I love, Chuck, you said something that I have found to be so true for me. And I'll steal a line from John Mark Comer in this one. He says, beware of the Sabbath because it will take over every day of the week. And the reason he says that is because you get to love Sabbath so much so that it is on your mind almost all week long. And I've had to be really careful to prepare during the week so that we can actually Sabbath well. We happen to do the traditional Sabbath of Friday evening at 6 p.m. We go through to Saturday at 6 p.m. But preparing throughout the week has been incredibly helpful for me so that I can actually Sabbath well on the weekend. So for example, I'll carve out an hour maybe in the afternoon or an evening to take care of something that I used to take care of on a Saturday. So for example, we have a pool, and so it needs maintaining. And it's not something, by the way, that I find replenishing or rejoicing in. It's a drain thing, and it's distracting. And so I choose to do that at another time during the week so that I can prepare and get ready for Sabbath. So I think that's incredibly important. I've blocked out time on my calendar to prepare for Sabbath, including even things like grocery shopping, because we launch our Sabbath every Friday night with what we call a Sabbath feast. And so we eat a big meal, almost like a party every Friday night to kick off Sabbath for our family. And so that requires preparing the meal and also purchasing the meal ahead of time. And so making sure that all those things are done ahead of time is really, really important. Any questions about preparation that you guys might have, or any comments on what you've experienced with having to prepare?
I have a question of preparation. It seemed like it was a lot easier when the kids were all in school and it was just me and my wife, because we did all the things around the house that needed to be done before we started. But now that just the schedule is different, we find that we are, Friday morning before we head off to the beach, the kids are in Zoom schools. We're scrambling to get all the stuff we need just together to go to the beach and then get our house in order. So when we come back, it's not a mess. So what are the, practices you have or tips that you have to plan all that out, to get all that done?
So I'm going to be super transparent, Chuck. I feel your pain. There are days, I mean, literally there are Friday afternoons at 5:30 when I have to get something to somebody because Sunday is coming, and because I work on Sunday mornings and I Sabbath until 6 p.m. on Saturday night. They can't wait to get maybe group questions for community groups to talk about after the message on a Sunday, for example. And so I must get those things out. I think the key thing that I've looked at is I've looked at what is absolutely necessary and what is not. And Sabbath has literally impacted what we value and what we prioritize across the board. So right down to, Chuck, our home is probably not as tidy as I would like it to be on Saturday evening, but I refuse to do things that are draining and a distraction from God's goodness to us. And so we allow certain things to slide. I allow things that used to be a major priority and a value to me to no longer be that important because I'm prioritizing Sabbath and rest over keeping up with the Joneses or keeping up with my home or whatever it is. So that's been super helpful. I do think that making sure that I prioritize a block of time. So for me, I find I need about 2 to 3 hours to prepare for Sabbath. And so blocking out that time, whether it's on Friday, finishing the day up a little bit earlier, if you have the flexibility to be able to do that, or spreading those 2 to 3 hours out over the week has been incredibly helpful when I don't have that time available on a Friday afternoon. But it comes down to, honestly, it comes down to priorities. Calendars are literally just a budget of your time. So just like a financial budget tells your money where it's going to go ahead of time, my calendar is where I'm telling my time where it's going to go ahead of time. And so I just find that calendaring those hours in is super important, super important. The next thing that I wrote down, the next P is the letter P that stands for practice. So getting in and actually doing it, I think, is one of those things that will actually help you to get a better handle on Sabbath. The longer you think about it and you plan it and prepare it, but don't actually practice it, the harder it becomes actually. So what I found to be super helpful, and a friend of mine, James Brummett, on the East Coast of the United States in Virginia, he helped me by saying, Jason, why don't you start small? He said, what if you just Sabbath for 4 hours this coming week? What if you blocked out just 4 hours and you said, I'm only going to do things that cause me to replenish and rejoice in God's goodness? What would that look like? And so practicing, you've heard the term before, we're looking for practice, not perfection. So practicing it, I think, is the best way to start developing this habit and this rhythm, is to just get started with something. And then I expanded it from 4 hours to 6 hours to 8 hours. We just kept adding time to where now we couldn't imagine not doing Sabbath and reorientating our entire world around it, in a sense, is kind of what we've had to do because we enjoy it so much. So I would say get in, start practicing it, start small. You don't have to do it 24 hours all at once. Remember what Jesus said: man was not made for Sabbath. Sabbath was made for man. So I think remind yourself of that even as you begin to practice. And then the last P, which doesn't actually fall into the right word, is I use the word perspective. And what I mean by that is stepping back after you practice it and evaluate, get some perspective on how the practice went, how you did, what are areas that you'd like to tweak and change and maybe improve on or whatever. I think that that's incredibly valuable. So I practice something almost nightly, which is St. Ignatius' prayer of examine. And I spend a little bit of time just looking at each day, what brought life, what was life-giving to me that day? What was a consolation in a sense? How was God coming to me in a way that was life-giving? And then what was a desolation? What was something that just was not life-giving at all? Kind of an adaptation of St. Ignatius' prayer of examine. And I simply use a 5-year journal. I stole this idea from Craig Rochelle. It's just a few lines. You get to see that same day over a 5-year period of time. So you can look back on that same day 3 years ago and see what was a consolation and a desolation for that day. I think the same practice can be applied to Sabbath and say, hey, what was life-giving? What was replenishing? What caused me to rejoice in God's goodness to me? And then what was draining? What was a distraction from rejoicing in God's goodness to me? I think practicing that perspective, I think, is really important to help you then in the following week just to make the changes and the tweaks that you'd want to make. So I love this quote from Carey Nieuwhof as we maybe go into some time of just chatting about Sabbath and hearing from you guys what you've learned and what you've experienced in answering some of the questions you had. I love this quote. Carrie says it this way: if you don't take a Sabbath, the Sabbath will take you. And in our hurried, busy lifestyles these days, I just am convinced Sabbath keeping could actually keep you out of the hospital. And eventually, if you don't take it, Sabbath is going to come knocking and is going to force you to slow down and force you to retreat and maybe even take you out of the game in some way if you don't take it. And so I would just encourage anyone that's listening, man, it's been so life-giving for our family. This is why I wanted to do the live podcast recording, is I so badly want people to experience the gift of Sabbath like God has graciously allowed our family to experience. And so if this is of help in any way along that journey, then my hope is that it will help people to do that. So questions that you guys have, I know there's a couple of things that we've touched on that maybe help to answer the questions. Adam, he asked this question: I can hardly sit still long enough to watch a movie. Do I have to just relax to practice Sabbath? I think we've touched on that with the replenishment cycle. It's a great way to look at those activities that are replenishing and cause you to rejoice as well. How to implement in a family if you're the only one with this mindset. I think that might have been a question, Jody, you may have asked possibly. And I would say modeling it is going to become so attractive to others that they want a part of that. You asked a question, Jody, that comes up all the time: making it work within other commitments so it doesn't seem like a consistent day that we have off. I love Eugene Peterson's description of a day off. He called it a bastard Sabbath. And it's kind of shocking to hear that. And I think it rightly so. It should be a little bit shocking that we don't, bastardize the Sabbath by just taking a day off and say, oh yeah, I have a Sabbath. But was it really replenishing? Was it something that really caused you to rejoice? Or were you just as busy as every other day doing non-paid work? One of the things I would say to your question though, Jody, because you talk specifically about kids' sports, and that's a question I get all the time, other activities. I actually find those things incredibly replenishing, watching my kids do sports, but only if we have the margin to not race around all day Saturday between games and then it's not replenishing. So one of the questions I would have is how many sports are your kids playing? Do they need to play that many? How often are they playing those games? Do they need to play twice or three times on a Saturday? Maybe there's a tournament or something like that once a year where they have to play multiple games. That's great. Is there another option? So for my youngest son is a really good basketball player. We've found a basketball league it's not quite competitive. It's very competitive, and they happen to play on Sunday evenings. And so after our Sundays are wrapped up, he plays basketball in the evenings. But we actually find that incredibly replenishing watching our kids sport. So again, I see that as being something you can do on Sabbath if it's something that is replenishing and causes you to rejoice. So how can I be more consistent was another question that came up. I think we've talked quite a bit about the idea of prioritizing it, planning for it, and then, just getting into the preparation and preparing to make sure that you're practicing it. And then I love this question, Chuck. You asked the question, how do you keep turning the time back to God and remembering why you're doing it to honor him in the first place? And so one of the things that I've implemented into my life is a system of alarms. I actually have the most ridiculous alarm systems on my phone. They go off at all different times of the day for different practices that I have. Like I practice the daily office every day for twice or three times a day. And so those are some of the tools that I've used. And that's been really helpful to me, even on Sabbath, to just have an alarm that goes off to start Sabbath. So 6 p.m. on a Friday evening, this ridiculous alarm that I use, which is called Keywake. It's an app that you can download on your phone. It's spelled Kiwake. Keywake has been incredibly helpful because it literally forces you to stop everything and it takes 3 steps to turn this alarm off, or else it just keeps going. And they're significant steps. They're not just like 3 touches. You have to really stop everything you're doing. So that's been helpful to kick it off. I also do that at the end as well. But then we do something where we light a candle at the beginning of the practice when we do our Sabbath feast. That's been incredibly helpful. And then even throughout the day, we'll pause, and I'll ask my kids, I'll ask Kristen, I'll ask myself the question, hey, what am I delighting in today? You know, I asked Kristen that question just last Sabbath, and she gave me a list of 6 or 7 things that she was delighting in that were so replenishing for her and she was rejoicing in. So I think talking about it throughout the Sabbath as well helps you to turn that attention back to God and say, hey, this is why we're doing it. It's not just, you know, a weekly vacation where we get to be selfish with our time. So hopefully that's helpful. Any other questions or any other comments? Man, I'd love to hear any more questions or comments you guys have.
I have a few comments. One of them is I think you missed a P. Something that has helped me be better at Sabbath is preaching it.
There you go.
People I mentor, I talk a lot about it with them as I transition to a new church here in California. It's something that I might be the only one that's really consistent with it, and everybody quickly notices, oh, Chuck's at the beach on Friday. I've gone even as far as my elementary school children's pastor. Him and his family come with us every Friday now. And that's something that started about midsummer. And so their kids are young like our kids. And so it's something that their family, so preaching it, I think it helps us as we try to get better at it. You know, we want to be able to practice what we preach or preach what we practice or whatever. But that's been super helpful for us. The other thing is something that we like to remember, at least for us, that we're trying to do something that's soul giving and life giving, and not necessarily just something that's restful. That's just for our family. So when we go to the beach, we go in all different directions. My wife rests. She sits on the beach. She walks around and collects shells. My kids dig in the sand and boogie board and wakeboard and surf. And I usually surf for 2 or 3 hours with my children's pastor. And I'm wiped out at the end of the day. We are so tired. And we typically then get a sitter and go out to dinner that night, me and my wife. But we're so wiped out, but it's so life-giving and soul-giving that we keep doing it. So for the listeners, just understanding it's not just rest. It can be an activity. It can be very active. It could be the gym or whatever. It can be active things that make you physically tired, but the goal is that it's life-giving and soul-giving. So
that's a great perspective, Chuck. I love that you added that, because it's not just about, hey, I don't want to be exhausted physically. It's about really replenishing your soul, which is much more than just your body, although I think it includes that as well. So I love that perspective. So good. And the other P, I wrote it down. I'm adding it to my list. I'm stealing it, but I'll give you credit. So I appreciate that.
Reach it.
Anybody else? Comments, questions, anything that comes to your mind?
Yeah. So my wife and I, we've talked about Sabbath, and obviously, like, knowing you, Perko, and you, Chuck, and just seeing how Sabbath has been like a really big part of your lives over the last couple of months and all the changes. It's something that we want to implement, and we want to, just put this into practice so that when we do have kids and when we do have a lot of commitments and obligations in the future, that we do find time to rest and we do find time to, reflect on our life and what God is doing in our lives. So I've learned a lot. Like, I've taken a lot of notes, and I'm really excited to just kind of sit down with Celeste and talk about it, and start small and obviously work our way up, but just find a healthy way to take care of our souls, because that's what's the most important. So
I love it. Somebody famous once said, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul? And I think our culture is really enticing us to try and gain the whole world. And yet, even just recently, I read the reflections on somebody that very well known in ministry, and they identified 3 things that they failed to do. They said that they neglected caring for their soul as one of those things. Reaching out for help was another one, and not paying attention to their spirit. But they talked specifically of the 3 things that they neglected. One of those was caring for their soul. And so I commend you, Brandon, for starting the process of doing that. It's so important. So Jody or Dad, anything else you got?
Yeah, I just think it's so essential. We've never done it on a very consistent basis, but when we do it, it does replenish us. And when we don't do it, it's not good. So I've done a lot of not goods, but yeah, we're getting into it, and we're starting small, and we're working on prioritizing it.
Love it. I love it. Jody, what about you? Any reflections?
Yeah, one thing that came to mind as you were talking and looking at what's soul giving, but also how we can bring it back to making sure we're still focused on God within those things, was sacred pathways.
Yeah.
Gary Thomas and Christy Thomas has also written it for kids. And it just reminded me, I'm like, oh, I need to look that up again and kind of look at, that would probably help to identify what is actually replenishing for me, for my daughter, for my husband. But looking at the ways, like I was thinking, often we love going on family walks through the bush and things, and being in nature really helps us to kind of replenish, but also still, have that wonder of what God has created and made, and the way all these things work together. So yeah, it brought that to mind. That could actually be a really useful tool.
Yeah,
that's
a great resource, and we'll put it in the show notes for people to check out, because I love the fact that you're talking about the specific ways that God has uniquely wired us for replenishment and reflecting on his incredible goodness. That's unique. It's a sacred, like you said, sacred pathways towards replenishment and rejoicing in him. That's so good. So good. Yeah, as we wrap up, I just want to encourage those that are listening. Your heavenly Father is so madly in love with you. And he is so proud, whether you do Sabbath perfectly or not, or any of those things, does not change his view whatsoever of how proud he is of you and how much he loves you, so much that he sent his son to die for each of us. And so this incredible gift is not to be a weight or a burden, but it's to be a gift. I'm reminded of the words that Jesus said in Matthew chapter 11, verses 29 to 30. These are some of my favorite verses of what Jesus said, and I love the Message version. It says, "Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly." I don't know about any of you that are listening, but this year, certainly, I wouldn't describe it as freely and lightly. It's been pretty heavy. But Jesus, he invites us to this thing of Sabbath and to spend time with him. And he says that when you do that, you'll learn these rhythms of grace, and that you will be able to live freely and lightly. So I encourage you to take up the practice of Sabbath, not because you have to, but because you get to, as a gift from your heavenly Father. Thanks for being with us, and thanks for enjoying the podcast. For those that are listening, look forward to talking to you guys soon.